A little ways from the town where I grew up, there's a forest with many camping spots. A few years back, I went to visit my family for a week and thought I'd go camping while I was there. My gear was pretty simple, but I wasn't aiming for anything extreme. I just wanted to find a nice spot to camp for a night or two. I started on a random trail and followed it for a while. I knew most of the paths led to a pond a few miles in, so I expected to end up there. However, as I reached about 5 or 6 miles in, I realized I was headed somewhere different. I was actually curious to see where it would take me, but after hours of walking, it felt like the trail was endless and leading to nowhere. Eventually, my legs were tiring, so I found a small clearing off the side of the path to set up for the night. It was getting dark, and I hurried to get everything ready and start a campfire. I barely had a few minutes before the forest was completely dark. The campfire lit up a decent area around me, but not enough for me to venture more than 15 or 20 feet away from my camp. I sat there, boiled some water, and made tea to relax for the night. It was hard to tell the time, but after about an hour, it was well into the night when I heard footsteps coming down the trail. At first, I thought it might be an animal like a bear, but as they got closer, I realized it was definitely a person. I listened as they walked, and their figure became slightly visible in the firelight. I was just far enough from the trail that I couldn't see them clearly, but I noticed they were tall and carrying a backpack. They didn't stop. They just walked past my campsite, and when the sound of their footsteps faded, I thought it was odd that they weren't using a flashlight and were hiking so late. However, seeing the large backpack, I figured they knew what they were doing, and that was the last I thought of it. I stayed by the fire for another hour, then waited for it to die down before getting into my tent to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night needing to use the bathroom. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but I couldn't get comfortable after waking up. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, walking about 20 feet from my campsite. After I finished, I turned to go back, but far off on the other side of my tent, I saw something move. The moonlight wasn't bright enough for me to see clearly, but I instinctively knew it was a person. I slowly walked back to my tent, my eyes wide, scanning the trees around my camp. I carefully reached in and grabbed my backpack, pulling out a flashlight. When I turned it on, it revealed a person standing by the trail, looking just like the figure I'd seen earlier. But just as quickly as I spotted them, they dashed behind the trees, and everything went silent again. I probably sat there for a minute with the flashlight before realizing there was nothing I could do but leave as quickly as possible. I packed up what I could, leaving my cheap tent behind, and started walking toward the trail. When I reached the spot where I'd last seen them, I felt even more terrified because there were no signs of them anywhere. I didn't know if they were watching me or even following me. I kept my flashlight on, cautiously moving down the path, shining it around the trees. Halfway through my walk, the sun started to rise, and I was able to make it back safely. Once I got home, I looked up the trail I took and discovered it wasn't even an established path. So maybe it was someone like me, just exploring. But that didn't explain what had happened. Why had they been near my camp in the middle of the night, and how long had they been there? I think that night was probably supposed to be my last, and leaving when I did was likely the only way I could escape. I was hiking along a trail I had come across in a remote part of a national forest. It was a round-trip route that usually takes about 3 days to reach the end, and another 3 days to return. I didn't know too much about how well-known the trail was, but usually on these longer hikes, it doesn't matter because you rarely meet many people. On the 3rd day of my hike, I passed a campsite where I saw a man sitting near his tent. I decided to take a break, and we chatted for a while. He mentioned he was staying the night and planned to hike to the highest point of the trail the next day. I told him I was heading there that same day and might see him later. After a short chat, I continued on my way and eventually reached the spot where I planned to camp for 2 nights. The view was breathtaking, unlike anything I had seen before, and it made for an amazing rest day at the trail's summit. The entire day passed, and no one came by. When night fell, I realized I was still the only one camping at the site. I thought back to the man I had met the day before, who said he would be reaching this point today, but he never arrived. I figured maybe he decided to turn back or stay another day at his previous campsite. The next morning, I packed my things and began the hike back, but I started a bit later than planned. I hoped to at least make it back to the campsite where I had met the man. For some reason, I was feeling unusually sore, and the day was quickly fading. Soon, I was hiking in the dark with my headlamp on, making my way down the trail for about an hour after sunset. Eventually, I reached the camp, and the man's tent was still there, set up just like before. Considering his plan to continue hiking and the fact that staying in one spot for several days while backpacking is uncommon, I called out to see if he was okay. There was no reply. I walked closer and mentioned that I just wanted to check on him, but the flap of his tent was slightly open, and no one was inside. A feeling of dread washed over me. I stood still, looking around, but saw no trace of him, until I noticed a faint light in the distance. It was a dim glow, barely visible, deep in the woods. I decided to approach, walking about 40 yards from the tents before I found the source. A headlamp lying on the ground, almost out of battery. As I bent down to pick it up, I realized someone was watching me. They were standing just 10 yards away, partially hidden and clearly trying to avoid being seen. I instantly felt that this wasn't the man I had met earlier, but I couldn't ignore the situation. "Hello? Do you need help?" I called out. The figure remained silent and motionless. "I'm sorry, I'll leave," I said nervously, then hurried back to the tent. Luckily, I hadn't unpacked anything yet, so I quickly grabbed my gear and began leaving the campsite. As I walked away, I saw the light in the woods go out. I kept moving and didn't stop until I had hiked another 3 miles to the next campsite. The next morning, I reported what had happened. Sadly, my fears were confirmed. The man I had met was now considered missing. There were almost no clues to follow, and in such a remote area, searching for someone is nearly impossible. Whoever I saw that night remains a mystery, but they might hold the key to what truly happened. Most of us, though, have a pretty good idea of what likely occurred. Earlier this year, I went camping in the woods, about 5 hours south of my home. There was a small pond I often visited. It wasn't well known, so it was always peaceful and quiet, the perfect retreat. On the first day, I arrived and set up camp. The place was deserted, just as I expected. The pond wasn't too big and had a sandy shore, surrounded by thick forest, allowing a clear view all around. Shortly after I settled in, I saw a man come out from the trees on the opposite side. He set up his tent and for a while kept to himself, seeming like an ordinary camper. But before sundown, he began walking around the pond towards my campsite. He greeted me with a friendly smile and introduced himself as John. He mentioned he wasn't sure if I noticed him setting up earlier, but he saw me and thought it would be nice to say hello, given how remote the location was. We talked for a bit, and John turned out to be a great guy. He was 28, close to my age, and we both appreciated the solitude of the spot. After chatting for about half an hour, he returned to his camp as the sun dipped below the horizon. That night was quiet, and nothing unusual happened. The next morning, we hung out together. He had brought some beers, and we spent most of the day by the water having casual conversations. It felt like I had found the perfect camping buddy. Later that evening, after we parted ways to our separate camps, I sat by my campfire, feeling grateful for meeting John. He seemed like someone I could enjoy camping with again. As the night grew darker, I prepared to put out the fire and head to bed. That's when I noticed John walking around the pond again. His campfire had been out for a while, so I assumed he'd already gone to sleep. But here he was, coming toward me. He approached the fire, and something felt off about him. "Everything all right?" I asked. He smiled, returning to his usual friendly self, and said he'd found a cool spot with an amazing view. He invited me to check it out, and though I hesitated, he insisted it was even better at night. His enthusiasm made it hard to refuse, and I figured, why not? It's not every day you get to see such a view while camping in the woods. I followed him around the pond and into the forest. There was no trail, but John navigated the dark woods as if he'd been here many times before. We walked for about 20 minutes before he slowed down and pointed ahead with a grin. I looked ahead and saw an old, rusted trailer, half consumed by nature. Moss had overtaken it, and the metal siding was riddled with holes. I turned back to John, confused, but his face was different, cold and expressionless. "What is this?" I asked, but he didn't respond. A wave of fear rushed over me, and as I scanned the area, I heard the creaking of the trailer door opening behind me. I barely glimpsed someone stepping out before I bolted. I could hear John and the other person chasing me, but I ran as hard as I could. I kept running through the woods until I lost them. By then, I was so far away that I didn't know where I was. I wandered through the forest until daylight, eventually finding my way back to the pond. From the treeline, I saw my campsite, but everything was gone. It looked like no one had ever been there. I stayed hidden, made my way back to the trail, and hiked to my car. I reported the incident to the local authorities, but they never found anything. Honestly, I don't think they really looked. I still don't know what was planned for me that night, but I'm grateful I escaped before finding out.